Hello again, everyone. I'm in Binghamton, New York. It's September 28th. I'm with my good friend Doug Ellison. We're at the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Historical Society Symposium. And of course, Doug has written a new book on the Utica branch of the present-day New York Susquehanna and Western, but going back to the late 1860s when the line first came into town. And Doug, your new book is a fond look at Phoebe Snow's Utica division, and it's published, sponsored by the Utica Mohawk Valley chapter of the NRHS.
That's right.
So, who was Phoebe Snow then?
Phoebe Snow was the iconic character of Lackawanna Railroad's passenger service in the early 1900s. She was a creation of an advertising agency, and she represented the cleanliness of the Lackawanna trains that burnt anthracite coal instead of bituminous. So you could wear white and go all the way from New York to Buffalo and still be clean and pretty looking, and so they used her as a advertising type thing to promote the cleanliness of their trains burning anthracite coal.
Right. Well, now that we know a little bit about Phoebe Snow, just tell us a little bit about yourself. You grew up in Earlville along the Utica branch, which is about 35 miles south of Utica, correct?
That's correct. I grew up there in the 60s and 70s and pretty much right next door to the tracks, and got to see the trains go by, and pretty soon got to wander over and meet the train crews and get up close, and eventually it became my playground and then later on my school of railroading.
And tell us a little bit about your railroading background, because you are a retired railroader.
Yeah, I'm a retarded railroader. I started out on a track crew on the Lackawanna and Sturbridge Railroad. That was my first railroad retirement paycheck, and I was nipping ties. That's a manual job on a track gang where you have a big claw bar and you nip the tie up against the base of the rail with a plate so that it can be spiked. So that's where I started my career, and I later went to the Adirondack Railway in 1980, Utica to Lake Placid as a brakeman. And then I went to Metro North down near New York City, worked the Harmon shops, and eventually became general manager and executive director of the Adirondack Scenic Railroad when that restarted in the 90s. I spent 7 years up in the Adirondacks, went to Omnitrax in Colorado, and I worked in the locomotive repair facilities and administration and purchasing. Later went into the finance department in Denver. I went into railroad consulting all over the United States, some of Canada, and then went to Alaska Railroad in projects management, engineering. Done a whole lot of different things.
And then you eventually ended up as the vice president of engineering mechanical for the New York Susquehanna and Western?
Yeah, I'd come back from Alaska and was doing consulting, and one of my consulting projects was putting the south end of the Utica branch back together again. That had washed out in 2006, and then multiple washouts due to storms after that. And it was a real mess, but our company was hired through Shenango County IDA to piece it all back together, and that was like a coming home again. So I completed that project in 2016, and a couple of years later the NYS&W approached me, and I became the vice president engineering and mechanical, and retired in August of 2021.
So you're really a modern day boomer.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah. So, and when we talk about the Utica branch, we're talking about Utica, New York, south really to Shenango Bridge, about 83 miles south of Utica, or what are we talking about?
Well, what we're talking about, the Utica division, as it was back in the old days, was Utica to Shenango Forks and Richfield Junction to Richfield Springs. So it included the Richfield branch, 22 miles. So you had 84 miles between the Forks and Utica and 22 miles to Richfield Springs.
And south of the Forks to Binghamton was 12 miles or so.
Yeah, it was about 12 miles, depending if you're going to the passenger station or the YO yard north of town here, or later on East Binghamton. So, roughly 92, 95 miles between Utica and Binghamton.
Okay, so it's the late 1860s, and Utica's got the Erie Canal east-west running through the city. It also has the Shenango Canal coming up from the south, and what was the need for another railroad, and what was that railroad that we're talking about in your book here, the early beginnings of the Utica Division?
All right. What was happening during the Civil War and afterwards in particular was industrialization. And what you needed was cheap coal. Cheap coal was the power of the day. And in order to do that, you needed a source for that coal. Well, coal was coming in over the Erie Canal, but canal boats are only so big. There's only so much coal you can put into it, and of course it's expensive. So if you're going to be an economic industrial powerhouse like Utica wanted to be, competing with Rome, competing with Syracuse and other areas, you needed a source of that cheap coal energy. The only way to do that was connect to the south with rail lines that also had the coal mines. And there were two of them, the Lackawanna and the D&H. So there were two sources of coal both to the south. So they built to the south, and what the Utica, Shenango, and Susquehanna Valley Railroad guys did, and you're not going to find this written anyway, but they kind of played one against the other. They drove south towards the Shenango Valley, where they could connect at Shenango Forks with the Syracuse, Binghamton, and New York, which was an affiliate of Lackawanna for Lackawanna coal. And then from Cassville area, they built over hill and dale towards the Albany and Susquehanna, which could connect them with D&H coal. Now originally, the idea was a railroad from Roundout near Kingston, New York on the Hudson River, coming north to Colliersville, north of Oneonta. That would take D&H coal coming off the D&H Canal, coming up the Hudson River, and then transloaded in the Roundout area to go to Colliersville to go over what we know as the Richfield branch to Cassville and up to Utica. So it's a two-pronged attack.
Right. So the Utica industrialists and the city itself wanted Pennsylvania coal.
Cheap coal.
And that came about through the Utica, Shenango, and Susquehanna Valley Railroad, which began laying tracks south out of Utica in the late 1867?
1867.
And
it started south out of Utica.
So we're looking at a scroll, a picture in your book of the, it's titled Utica, Shenango, and Susquehanna Valley Railroad. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, that's a scroll that was filed with the county of Shenango for the surveys. When you were building a railroad, now the Harley Parade's gone. Okay, that was filed with the county of Shenango when they did the survey. Back in the day when you were building railroads, you had to file your surveys with each county. So that's what that scroll is. That's the actual original survey scroll, which if you open that up, you could just roll it all out, and there was the initial survey of the railroad.
And that's still in the
Shenango
Shenango County Clerk's office.
Yes.
That's pretty amazing. Now, next, we're going to look at what you've labeled in your book as the second passenger train to Waterville in 1867. And what is the where is that train? Where's the photograph? What is it depict?
That's a photograph, and it's basically a photograph of the first day that the railroad opened. The grand opening of the railroad was when it finally got down to Waterville. It actually had a terminal or place to really go to. So when Utica to Waterville was completed on November 14th, 1867, they had the grand opening. And they ran a number of trains from the old Utica and Schenectady built depot out of downtown Utica by Baggs Square down to Waterville that day for the celebration. And this is a picture of that. It's the second train out of the depot that day. I think there were 4.
And so that train would have gone right down Skyler Street, of course.
Yes, it's headed for Skyler Street in the picture. So what it's doing, it's coming out of what we know now is the Susquehanna Yard, and he's making that left-hand bend, and he's crossing the Erie Canal by Lock 46 and what's now Oriskany Boulevard. So he went over the top because at that time they were not allowed to build a swing bridge over the canal. So they had to come up out of the yard and bridge not only the street there, but they had a bridge over the top clearance-wise of the canal and then drop down in order to get to Skyler Street. Now later on, they were allowed to have a swing bridge, but back on that, when it was open, they were not allowed to.
And I see workers between the passenger cars. Are they brakemen to work the handbrakes?
They're probably brakemen.
Wow. So now, speaking of Skyler Street, and I should mention this as an aside, I've been a YouTuber for about 10 years now, and probably 75% of my videos are in the Utica branch, and every time I had a question, Doug was there to answer it. So he's a great source of information. But Doug, one of the biggest things I hear time and time again is, why on earth is there a railroad down the middle of a street? Are Americans backwards? Believe it or not, I mean, it's because a lot of folks from Europe can't understand the concept of a street running railroad, and maybe a lot of Americans can't who aren't interested in railroads. But how did it come to be that it had to go right down the middle of Skyler Street?
Well, by the time that the railroad was formed, there was the city of Utica, and the area around the city of Utica was built out, so there was no natural route out without going down some street easement. And Skyler Street was picked as the most viable way in order to get a railroad from the Mohawk River, which was much closer to the yards than it is now, but from that area where the New York Central was south, and Skyler Street was chosen for that, and the city was granted an easement to the railroad in early 1867 in order to do that.
Skyler Street isn't too far from where the Shenango Canal and the Erie Canal junctioned in West Utica.
Right.
But the neighbors weren't too happy about Skyler Street becoming a train right of way. I know they sued.
Well, not in my backyard, but
right.
Actually, the city of Utica, if you look at that vote, it was very much in favor. The city council very much in favor of the railroad, because they knew what it was going to do. It was going to bring the coal into Utica. It's going to do all sorts of great things for it.
So
now they were for it.
Now we'll turn our attention to some photos appearing in your book of Skyler Street, and this first one is from the late 1940s by Dante Tranquil, a well-known Utica area photographer who worked for the newspapers. And can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing in this picture?
We've got a northbound train at the corner of Knox and Skyler Street. It looks like a beautiful summer day. It's just a gorgeous photo, and very nostalgic, evokes ideas and memories of times past. You have the kids at the street corner there watching the steam engine come through, and I think that was very much the end of an era, though.
Because the steam went off the Utica division about 1950 or so?
1951.
So this would have been right near the end of the steam era.
Right near the end of the steam era, the end of the Age of Innocence, and the last days when, Skyler Street was a real nice-looking place.
Now, the next photo that's going to come up is a photo by Joe Schmidt, and it shows, is it Fairfield Morse? What's the name of the train master?
Fairbanks Morse.
Fairbanks Morse, two engines running light, heading south on Skyler Street. What's the story behind Joe Schmidt, who is a DL&W trainman, right?
Trackman. Yeah, Joe hired out in the 1930s as a trackman, and worked for a while. I guess he got laid off, and then he came back in the 40s when they did the big rehab of the line back during World War II.
So why did those train masters come up to Utica?
They were National Guard trains. New Jersey National Guard used to run trains up from Hoboken, and then they'd go to Utica or Syracuse, and the New York Central would pick them up to go up to Pine Camp, later Camp Drum, Fort Drum, up in the Watertown area. So there'd be trainloads coming up, multiple trains coming up. They'd turn the cars over to the New York Central, in this case at Utica, and then the locomotives would deadhead back south to Binghamton running light. And so we see the train master there, and that's an extremely rare photograph. And it happened once, obviously, I think it may have happened a second time, but that would have been the only time those big engines would have come up to Utica. The Fairbanks Morse engines were 2,400 horsepower apiece, big engines, biggest on the Lackawanna, 6-axle. It was just very unusual for them to be on the line, although they did use the E8s also coming into Utica.
Now we're switching over to the Penn Central era, and this photograph is from August of 1972. Doug, what was the Penn Central doing on the Erie Lackawanna?
That was my question too, if you read the book. What the heck are those guys doing here? Well, it seems in late 1971 there was a consolidation of some of the rail routes through Utica. The West Shore line that cut diagonally through South Utica was just full of grade crossings and just a real pain to operate and maintain. And the Lackawanna had taken over a bunch of O&W trackage, and they kind of had the long way around to get down into Mohawk containers. So it was a way of getting the by this time Penn Central's West Shore line off of all the streets in South Utica. What they came up with was an agreement of a consolidation between the Penn Central and Erie Lackawanna tracks. So all that West Shore trackage through South Utica was ripped up, and in order to get to the New York Mills branch of the Penn Central guys would run down Skyler Street to the old diamond where the Lackawanna and West Shore came together, and then they'd hit the West Shore and go up their New York Mills branch.
And of course, this picture is at the very northerly end of Skyler Street, and that's the Skyler Street Tower that still exists today.
Right. So they've just come off the street, and they're going to go down through the Erie Lackawanna yard, then cross over into their own yard.
Okay, now we're going to move ahead till to the end of the Conrail era, at least on the Utica division. Tell us what this picture shows, Doug, from October of 1981 with is that your Plymouth car in that picture, your Plymouth Fury, right?
Yes, my 1963 Plymouth
all
Fury
right,
chase
Doug.
vehicle.
So tell us all about that picture, please.
All right, I think that evokes, going back to Dante Tranquill's photo of the steam days. You still have kids there at the curbside watching the train go through, but it's diesel now. One of the significances of this photo, this is a southbound train at Walnut and Skyler Street. They're going out to go down to Sangerfield. That lead engine was a former D.L.W. engine, and it was one of the initial engines used to dieselize the train, to kill the steam engines. So it's now, it's been repowered with an EMD engine, painted Conrail blue, but that was one of the original locomotives to dieselize the line.
And next we're looking at another Dante Tranquill photograph that appears in your book, showing a view from the tower, and maybe you could say a few words about this. It's a really interesting photograph.
Yeah, that was the manual control tower for the Skyler Street grade crossing. There were the cross streets all down Skyler Street, and they had to be protected. Prior to 1952, that was gatemen at each crossing corner. So at each street corner, there'd be a gatehouse with a crossing flagman there to protect traffic against the trains. The Public Service Corporation and DL&W got together in the early 50s, and they designed this elevated crossing tower. So a guy could sit up there and electronically, through those switches that you see, control the crossing protection, which was either flashing lights or setting the traffic lights so that it would stop cross traffic as the train went down the track.
And it shows that Jack Hopkins was the operator that day. Did you know him?
No, I did not know him. He was retired by the time I came around.
And moving on, Skyler Street wasn't the only street in Utica that had street running. I was surprised to see this picture in your book from December of 1949. And could you tell us about this? What railroad is it? What's the street?
That's the O&W, and that's Fay Street. So the O&W line came up, and they also needed access to get into downtown Utica to connect with the New York Central and have a downtown passenger station. So again, because the city had been built out, they had to figure out a way to do that, and they chose Fay Street as their access.
When did they come in, Doug?
1871, late
So,
1871.
4 years or so after the Utica, Shenango, and Susquehanna
Yeah.
Valley, which became the DL&W, of course.
Right.
So what? I really like that it said 6th Ward Hotel over to the right of the photo. That's I don't even know if that building is still there. But so that was from December '49. Who was this Sam Rosoff guy?
Sam Rosoff was he mainly really into subways and subway construction in the New York City area, and he was a millionaire, quite a character actually, and he'd been down in South America and various other countries.
Then he finally came to Utica, right?
Well, the O&W had been in bankruptcy since 1937, and here we are in 1949, and Sam thought if he bought it, he could really make a go of it. Oh, I don't know. Anyway, the O&W ran a passenger special for him so he could inspect the line. So December of 1949, he did a tour of the whole railroad. And there was a lot of expectation that Sam Rosoff was going to pull it out of bankruptcy and really make something out of it.
Never happened.
No, so
But Sam had a nice ride, probably.
He did. He saw a lot of railroad there. So they came up the line to Clinton. They went around the Y at Clinton, and they actually backed into Union Station. So that'd be the easiest way to turn the train there because they had the observation car on the rear end. So they actually backed into Utica, down to Union Station. They got out, and I guess they used the pay phones down there to call around and catch up with their messages, and then they pulled out and went south and disappeared into history.
That's one of the favorite pictures and I have of mine in your book. I mean, your book is 323 pages long with 425 great photos, but that's one of my favorite.
Yeah, and I believe that's the chapter archives right there. So.
There you go. So now this next photo shows a little structure in West Utica, and I know you wrote it was demolished in '79, and I actually remember it being there. Shows my age a little bit, but tell us a little bit about this cool little structure. Why was it built?
Okay, there was always a stop in West Utica. For a long time, it was the Hotel Devereaux, which was just up the street from there. But in 1911, because of the suburban growth outside the city of Utica, there were so many people that wanted to catch a train, but they didn't necessarily want to go downtown to do it. Now, that could mean riding a trolley. The trolley line went right past there, too. So Lackawanna actually established a station there so that people in the West Utica area could more easily connect with and take trains. And that's where that originated with.
In its last days, what was it used for by the railroad after passenger service ended in 1950?
Well, that depot closed long before the passenger service ended. In the 1930s, it became the roadmaster's office. So the roadmaster's a guy that went out there and had charge of the crews repairing the line, the track. So
Did you ever get to go inside of that?
I never did. I never really knew what it was until it was gone.
Doug, when did you buy that Plymouth Fury?
1978.
Well, you could have got down there.
Well, I was there. I just didn't know what it was.
So, okay, we're going just a little out of order here, but I also enjoyed this picture from some cool-looking high rails from Waterville in 1964. Can you tell us a little bit about this and why, in your words, the locals, this became the talk of the town when they ran their annual inspections?
Yeah, by the 1960s, high rail had really caught on. That's where you have an automobile or a truck on high rail wheels to go on the railroad. And Erie Lackawanna was a big early proponent of that, apparently. And as part of their annual sales tours, they had these Ford Country wagons on high rail. And for about at least 3 years, their sales teams, or sometimes the division superintendent, would come up in the wagons there. But apparently there was an advance notice because people all around would talk about the station wagons going down the railroad tracks. So that's what you see there at Waterville. That was actually 1965, taken by Bill Gale, who was the Utica area sales representative based in Utica.
Oh, and isn't there, and I know it's Bill Gale and Son, the big ag mill in Waterville, right? Is it Lewis Gale?
That's Lewis Gale, no relation to
No
Bill.
relation, no kidding.
No, Bill came off Pennsylvania Railroad and hired on to the Erie Lackawanna, and he was there about a month after the merger happened in 1960. He was there through 1967.
So let's move on to this next photo, Clear the Tracks by Joe Bromley. You might also be the modern day Joe Bromley, but tell us a little bit about Joe Bromley and his book, Clear the Tracks.
Joe was a locomotive engineer that worked on the Utica branch between 1882 and 1909. He'd come over from the Utica and Black River, and one of the reasons was they were wood burners up there, and when they started getting the coal burners, the Utica and Black River hired Lackawanna men who knew how to fire coal-fired locomotives, which was different than firing a wood locomotive. And so Joe complained about that, and I guess maybe it was his mother said, well, if the Lackawanna men can go to the Black River, then why can't the Black River men go to the Lackawanna? So he walked into Tom Thatcher's office, who's the master mechanic there in Utica,
and I remember reading Clear the Tracks.
Said he wanted to hire on, and you know,
Tom Thatcher was a tough guy, if I recall.
He was a tough guy, I'll tell you what.
I know Mr. Bromley's obituary is also included in your book, and it was mentioned that he sold over 120,000 copies as of the time of his death of Clear the Tracks, and those that were sold during the war year he wouldn't charge servicemen for.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. Yeah.
So go ahead. Were there some other things you wanted to mention?
Yeah, Joe writes a history of his time between 1882 and 1909, and well, he's got a lot of great stories in there. He did this just about World War II era, as you mentioned, and looking back on it, and sometimes maybe his memory wasn't so good. So when you read the book, you kind of like scratch your head a little bit. Well, what really happened and what didn't happen and how might it have happened? And in my book, I kind of review a lot of his stories and say, okay, here's what happened, and here's kind of the rest of the story to what Joe said. And anyway, it's a fascinating read.
It's still available on eBay.
Yes, eBay. It's still available.
Yeah.
So later, Joe moved down here to Binghamton. He lived right over on Front Street, and his house is still there. It's called Staplehurst.
He ended up being an inspector for the Federal Railroad Administration.
His hearing got bad, and even back then, you had to pass your hearing test. And he was getting a little scared about that, so he got out of the engineer job and into an inspection job with the ICC.
So moving on to another big feature of the Utica line, Paris Hill.
Yeah.
What is Paris Hill? How long is it? Why is it an operational challenge for the railroads?
Well, it's about 16 miles, and it really starts as you're leaving Utica. As you're coming out of the yard to Skyler Street, you're coming upgrade, and it's pretty much upgrade all the way to Paris Station.
And we're now looking at a photo from the 1890s, which I also found very interesting. You describe it as the crew being proud, rough, and ready. And it must have taken some time for them to set their brakes, you said. Tell us a little bit about this photo.
Okay. Well, like you said, taken in the 1890s, and they're stopped there at the Clayville Depot, and probably the tail end's just clear of the crossing. That's the old hotel on the right, and you see a stone wall. That stone wall, if you look real close, is still there, I believe.
It is, yeah.
So they're posed proudly there, but again, back in those days, you'd have had to set up the handbrakes and take a little time to secure that train so everybody could go up front to pose.
And I think
lest the train run away from you.
No, I think you mentioned that maybe the roadmaster would have not been too pleased to know how much time they took to set the brakes for the photographer.
I wonder, the dispatcher, what was he thinking there on this train delay, and how was he going to explain that one, because these guys wanted to pose for their picture. But that's what it was all about, the good time railroad. So
next we're looking at a photo from about maybe 50 or 60 years beyond of northbound freight in Clayville coming down the grade from the late 1940s. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, that photograph's from the collection of Henry Williams, who was one of the locomotive engineers. And what you see is extra 1255. That's a Mikado coming down the hill with the brake shoe smoke. They didn't have dynamic brakes and diesels, so you set the air and the brakes smoked at the rear of the train. You see the bell ringing there. And he's coming down for Utica bound.
It's a pretty dramatic photo, and
yeah.
I think I know you wrote in your book that coming up the hill was one thing, but coming down could even be more of a challenge.
Absolutely.
And
you had to fight your way up the hill, but you better make sure you had things under control coming down, or you'd go down a lot faster than you wanted to.
Now
Bill here, he knows. He's run the hill.
There's Mr. William Law, my video assistant today. So one of the great things about your book is you intertwine stories about the nuts and bolts of why the railroad came along and operational, but you blend in a lot of good personal stories. So one of your stories was Bruce Sharp's wild ride, and we're looking at a photo of Bruce, not taken during the event you're going to describe, but a photo
at night.
A photo of him and maybe a little bit afterwards. But the Erie Lackawanna guys are up in Clayville, and they're trying to set a car off, and they got one on the main, a Main Central boxcar, I think, correct?
Yeah, it was a brand new Main Central boxcar. They were switching the Clayville paper mill there down by the depot.
And this is January of '67.
January '67.
And
Bruce hired out in '66, so he hadn't been around very long.
So what's his wild ride all about, Doug?
Well, like I said, he hired out as a young man in his 20s in 1966, and shortly after that, he was in the big pile-up at Brisbane in September. So he just recovered from that wreck and come back to work, and he was on the Sherburne Local, January of '67. And they were doing the work there, like you said, at Clayville at the paper mill. And they set out this brand new Main Central car to get it out of the way, and they put it on the main, and Bruce went up. That's when they had the handbrakes up towards the top of the roof there to set the handbrake, and he's winding it on, but it's not working, but they uncoupled the locomotive. That's really not something you want to do. So anybody that's railroading, setting a car out on a descending grade, there's certain things you got to keep in mind. Well, they didn't that day, and Bruce took off, hanging onto the car there, trying to wind the handbrake on.
Well, maybe someone doesn't want the story to be told, but get going, Doug.
All right, so he's up there trying to wind it on. They realize, my God, the handbrake's not working. And Jim Page was there with him. Jim was a conductor, and he was up there too, and he finally bails off there at Clayville, leaving Bruce on all by himself, drifting down the hill. Well, it's a pretty steep hill. It's 1.55%, 1.7% compensated for the curvature. So away he went. They had GP7 1278. Ray Kaminsky was the engineer, and Don Wing was firing, so they went chasing after him down the hill. So there they go, and they figure Bruce on the car was doing between 50 and 60 miles an hour after he got through Clayville. And I asked Bruce about that. I said, what was that like? He goes, oh, it was really hard to hang on. I said, what do you remember about it? He goes, well, he said, the crossing gates, you start to see things flash. He said the gates wouldn't even be down, and I was across the crossings, and you could hear the bridges going through those through truss bridge or through plate girder bridges. He said, whoosh, 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 as he come down the hill. Now, Don Wing was firing, and I asked Don about it. He goes, oh, yeah. He says, we went chasing, we were going like hell after him. He said the headlight of the engine would come around the corner there, and we could see him hanging on the boxcar there in front of us. And said Ray was really pouring it on going down the hill, and we were afraid that, we were going to hit somebody at a crossing. And he said, we're chasing right after him. And they got down to Higbee Road.
Which was about 7 miles from where it started, I think.
Yeah.
And what happened there,
Higbee
Doug?
Road crossing there. The guy that ran the liquor store at the New Hartford Plaza.
His name was John Brown.
John Brown. He had a brand new Cadillac. He's just getting ready to go down to Florida for the winter. and he come across the crossing there and got T-boned by the boxcar, and he was killed. And Bruce was thrown off, and he was severely injured, but he did recover and come back to work later.
Now, also mentioned in your book was a little snippet about another man named John Brown, who was a motorman for the Utica and Mohawk Valley Railway, and he happened to run into a parked DL&W coal train on Genesee Street in South Utica and fractured his skull.
Yeah.
So my question to you, Doug, Mr. Historian, is if your name is, and that happened in January of 1913.
Yes.
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 So my question to you is this: if your name is John Brown, and you're in Utica in January of any year, and you happen to come across some railroad tracks, should you exercise extra caution?
Absolutely.
And by the way, that John Brown, who was the motorman, he did have serious injuries. He did survive. I know from doing research on the trolley lines that he sued the railroad a few years later. I have no idea if he succeeded or not. But I don't think it's the same John Brown from 1913 to 1967. That would be too much of a coincidence. Maybe it was his grandfather. Who knows? So a little more in the personal with a railroader story. We're looking at a picture here from March 31st of 1931.
33.
33?
Yeah.
Well, oh yeah, 1933. So what's going on in this picture, Doug?
This is Ed Bryant's last day. He was one of the old-time engineers, and he's posed there up under Genesee Street at Utica with a train getting ready to go to Binghamton for his last run. He did a turn to Binghamton and back, and it was quite a run, and it's all written up in the book. And a lot of that information came from Henry Williams, one of the engineers who actually wrote the story. There's quite a bit to that day. It was also filmed by Dave Bryant, who was Ed's son. Dave had a Franklin automobile, and he chased his dad down that day. And he got down by North Norwich, and he was filming from his automobile. And back in those days, it was a lot more open. You could look across from the highway, the state road, which is Route 12 now, over towards the railroad tracks. So he's filming that as they're going. He claims the speedometer in his Franklin was reading 85 miles an hour. Now, Doug Preston, who was former Oneida County historian and one of our Utica Mohawk Valley chapter members, he said he'd seen that film. He said it was a little fuzzy, but the speed was incredible.
Wow.
So we learn all about Ed Bryant's last run and the 1105 locomotive that was used on it and how fast they were running that day.
Now, this next picture is also vintage railroading from Utica from July of 1928, if I had that correct. And tell us, it's from the Jack Coughlin collection. Jack's a great guy. So tell us a little bit about what's shown here and why the big deal about a new big locomotive coming into Utica. Why was that newsworthy?
Okay, up until July 1928, they couldn't run the big engines into Utica. And naturally, as railroads evolved, they wanted to have a lot of cost savings. The Utica bridges were built very light, and the turntable in Utica wasn't big enough to turn the big engines. So they had to do some upgrading. That would mean they could run heavier freight cars, but also bigger locomotives, so they could pull more freight cars per locomotive. Now, a lot of guys didn't like that because that meant some jobs off. You were consolidating, making your trains longer and heavier, so there was some consternation about that. But this photo that you see is when they brought the first big engine into Utica in July of 1928, after they'd done the bridge upgradings and lengthened the turntable at the roundhouse so they could turn them around.
So, switching then to this next photo, the West Shore Railroad and the DL&W met at grade about a third of the mile or so east of where French Road is in South Utica now, I believe. And I've never seen a picture showing this. And just tell us a little bit about this. It says train 815 hits West Shore Diamond. Tell us a little bit about that picture, please.
Yeah, this is back in 1930, and we are at the West Shore Diamond. We're looking at train 815. He's coming north from Binghamton. He'll go into Utica Union Station. You see him there crossing the double track West Shore line. I think that one track was actually a main track, the other track was a siding. So he's right at the Diamond, and currently that is where the NYS&W goes south, and there's a switch, and they'll go off to the right in order to serve the New Hartford Industrial Tract, former O&W, and the Mills branch, which was the former West Shore New York Mills branch.
And there's a little bit of West Shore trackage before they get to that O&W section.
The tracks to the right there that you see in the picture are the tracks they currently run on the former West Shore across French Road.
So, getting on to the Richfield Springs branch, basically the line off the Utica Main. We got the fire department here now, Doug. They know this is a hot story.
Oh, there's a fire station there.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, he's backing the truck in.
I've got commentary by Bill Maw, also a retired railroader.
Yeah, you got two retarded railroaders.
So the Richfield Spring branch diverged off the Utica Main about 12 miles south of Utica at a point called Richfield Junction, correct?
Yeah, it was originally called Cassville Junction. In the early 1870s, it became Richfield Junction.
And the first station, I believe, off of Richfield Junction was Bridgewater. And tell us about this photo we're looking at here of the Bridgewater station. What's noteworthy about that?
That may be the original station. There's some speculation that maybe that's actually the second station due to the original measurements that were given. But that's the early station that was to the north of where the present one is. The present station that you see at Bridgewater now along Route 20 was built as a union station between the Unadilla Valley Railroad and the Lackawanna. This was an earlier version of that. And you came out of Richfield Junction, you had Brown Switch, then you had North Bridgewater, and then Bridgewater, which was actually the first major point, if you want to call Bridgewater that.
And then next we've got, I believe, East Winfield from the early 1900s, and you mentioned there were a lot of livestock dealers there. What can you tell us about this particular photo?
Okay, that's a train, and he's headed towards West Winfield from Richfield Springs. So he's coming down the hill. He'll go into West Winfield. That area was full of livestock dealers. You had West Winfield and East Winfield for many years noted for that business. And this depot here was in at least two different locations that we know of. And then later was completely taken out and moved towards Richfield Springs and named Cedarville, or locals called it Chepachet.
And now the Richfield Spring branch, just to bring us up to date, was abandoned by the Susquehanna, not maybe abandoned, but the rails were lifted in the mid-90s. And now a gentleman named Ben Gottfried, I believe, has bought the right-of-way and has started a narrow-gauge tourist operation along parts of the rail. So going back to the 1870s, this photo of West Winfield, what can you tell us about that?
West Winfield in the 1870s, that is definitely the first depot built there in 1869. And you see a train that's come in from the junction, and he's headed towards Richfield Springs. Very, very early shot. And that is standard gauge days. There was some speculation, people that saw that thought that maybe that was the 2 years that they had the 6-foot gauge tracks, but it isn't.
Now in Richfield Springs, which was the terminus of the Richfield Springs line, as far as I know, unless you always correct me, and I don't mind. That's why I call you Professor Ellison. But this photo really piqued my interest. There was a electric interurban that began in 1902 between Mohawk, and Oneonta. And this photo, tell us what this photo shows and why it's really, what's the deal with this photograph?
All right, this is the Southern New York Railway freight motor number 90, and he's making his interchange at Richfield Springs. That's the Richfield Springs freight house of the Lackawanna.
And I never heard of interchange between interurbans and regular railroads, but it must have been
Absolutely.
common, yeah.
It was common. In the late 20s, there were almost 800 cars a year that they were interchanging
In
between
Richfield
these two
Springs.
railroads at Richfield Springs, yeah.
But in reading your book,
Yeah.
I learned that the DL&W wasn't too keen on doing an interchange with the Southern New York or its predecessor. Why weren't they keen at first?
No, they weren't, and neither was the D&H, because what they were afraid of is the...
I see a rough-looking dog in the background too there, Doug. We better finish up.
Okay. Again, as we've talked before, John, coal was very proprietary. You had Lackawanna coal and D&H coal. And one of the things neither railroad wanted was the other bridged by this interurban delivering the competitor's coal someplace. They didn't want that. Eventually, they all came to terms. And I don't know if coal was actually moved or not. I don't know that much about the coal part of it, but freight cars were, and there were a lot of stone cars
From
that came
Boonville,
down,
right?
Yeah, out of Boonville. There may have been some out of McConnellsville area too. And they came off the New York Central at Utica to the Lackawanna. The Lackawanna took them to Richfield Springs, handed them over to the Southern New York. They moved them all the way down to Oneonta for highway construction back in the 1930s.
And that interurban was pulled up, I think, in 1942, early 1940s.
Yeah, about the beginning of World War II.
So,
And by the way, John, the interchange track with the SNY there you see at Richfield Springs for years while the Erie Lackawanna.
we got a noisy customer at KFC next door. Okay, we got the fire department, KFC, motorcycles, rough dogs. But go ahead and finish your story,
All right.
Doug.
The interchange track there between the SNY and the Lackawanna for many years till the Erie Lackawanna sold the line to the Central New York Railroad. That track was called the trolley track.
And I know you've mentioned Ted Jackson before. We're showing a picture of him, I think, from 1950. He was a friend of yours. He had quite a long life. What do we see in this picture here? Who was he? What did he do?
In the picture that you see there, he was wire chief at Syracuse on the New York Central. But he'd grown up on the Utica branch at Hubbardsville and at Richfield Junction, carried a camera as a kid. His grandfather was the agent at Hubbardsville and at Richfield Junction. And his grandparents raised him. Ted always wanted to be a railroader. And he got to know the crews, rode the trains, took pictures back in the 1930s when, it was the Depression and people didn't have a lot of money, but young Ted was out there snapping photos and getting the stories from the old crew people who were there in the early 1900s. And we've passed down some of Ted's stories from people who passed them on down to Ted. He was a good friend of mine. And
Didn't he just pass away recently? I mean, he almost made it to 100, didn't he?
2017, maybe. We had just finished the rehab of the line below Norwich when he passed away, so he knew about that.
What responsibilities did a wire chief have? You don't know? I don't know. It says wire chief.
I don't know. No.
This is the first question you don't know the answer to. But anyhow,
I don't want to make something up that I don't
No.
know. I'm not sure.
Did he work for the Central and retire as a New York Central, or did he go back to the Lackawanna?
Well, Ted hired out as a trackman initially with the Lackawanna when they built the Route 20 overpass at Sangerfield. And then he became an operator in 1940. But there were a lot of jobs coming off, and he was an extra man. So he worked both the Utica side and the Syracuse side, and he finally was able to hold a little bit at Syracuse, but he saw the writing on the wall with stations being closed and decided the New York Central offered more job security. And so he went over to the Central just before World War II, and retired on Conrail about 1981 out of Woodard.
So this next picture is also of Ted when he was still on the Lackawanna. What's he doing and where is he?
Ted's hooping up orders at Richfield Junction. Got a train coming up the hill there. You see the fireman reaching down to grab the orders off the order fork, and that would tell the crew what their next moves would be down the line.
A bygone day of railroading.
Bygone day of railroading.
So, Doug, we're going to conclude with an extraterrestrial story on the Utica branch, and how could something be extraterrestrial about Utica branch? But I guess there is, because it's in your book and it's got to be 100% accurate. That's the way I look at it. So Doug, what was there a UFO on the Utica branch or not? Let's settle once and for all this long-running mystery.
There was definitely a UFO on the Utica branch. Absolutely. So in 1966, this is when the Bull was running cars.
Well, we got to stop.
Okay.
What's the Bull?
Okay.
That's yeah. Sorry for the sidetrack. Pardon the pun, but I think that's an interesting aside.
All right. One of the freight trains that operated out of the Lackawanna was known as the Bull, and it would go and leave Utica usually in the evening, go to Binghamton, and then come back either the next day or make a turn depending on what year we're talking about. A lot of stories, speculation on how the train got the name Bull, and we'll go over some of that in the book.
Fair enough. So let's return to outer space.
So the Bull was headed south in April of '66. Back in those days, they had a lot of stone cars that came out of McConnellsville and Boonville for the Interstate 81 highway projects. So they had 4 units that evening coming out of Utica, heavy train. They're coming down through Waterville. Jim Dundon was running, and Bob Knight was firing. So Bob's over on the left-hand side, and he jumps up and starts yelling, "A UFO, a UFO." Runs across the cab behind Jim, opens the back door of the locomotive. Jim's looking back to his right, and Bob's looking out the door there to the northwest. And there's just a big fireball burning across the evening sky there. Whoa, what was that? So they get down to Binghamton. The engine crew doesn't say anything. Roger Haynes was the conductor. Don't say anything, figuring did you see anything? Did you see anything? Well, nobody said they saw anything. I don't know what that was all about. But it was apparently a meteor that came over. And there's a 14-year-old boy, Dana DeGeorge, up on Deerfield Hill north of Utica. He caught a picture of it. And that appeared in the May 6, 1966 issue of Life magazine. A lot of the train crew guys bought that issue, remembering that day.
Well, Doug, this has been a great interview. Appreciate you talking to me, and my help from my high school friend Bill Mall here. The book, it was really, I think, fair to say, in the making for decades, doesn't it? How long had you really been working on it, on and off?
Well, I guess the idea kind of germinated in the late 1970s when I was hearing all these stories these guys were telling me, and then a few years later thinking, if these aren't told, they're going to disappear. All this history's going to be gone. And then I realized how much history I didn't know. So I started a quest that kind of went from the late 70s right up until I finally got the book written.
Well, it's a great job. It's a great read, and we'll have information on how to purchase the book in the description. And again, thank you for sitting down, and thanks also to Bill Mall.
I've enjoyed this, from all this information rolling off the lips of Professor Ellison.
Yes, and Bill worked for the Susquehanna too, and is very familiar with Paris Hill and all these other stories we've been talking about the railroad, the Utica division. Well, thanks again. So from Binghamton, New York, where there's all kinds of activity going on, this is Railroading Rambler with Doug Ellison and Bill Mall saying goodbye for now.